Welcome to the program, Colonel Ingram.
Nice to be here. Thank you for asking me.
If Ukraine does not prevail, UK could be at war with Russia soon. That's what retired colonel of the British Army, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, wrote in The Telegraph. Do you feel that the United Kingdom is in a pre-war situation right now?
Well, I know Hamish de Bretton Gordon very well. He is a close friend. And yes, there is a real potential for the UK, along with NATO, to be at war with Russia if Ukraine does not prevail. I don't think the UK is necessarily ready at the moment. I don't think NATO is ready. But I think that the war in Ukraine has acted as a wake-up call for the different member nations of NATO to start to prepare themselves and recognize that it is a possibility. We're some way off it yet, but it is a possibility that we have to prepare for.
Wall Street Journal reported that Russia could attack a NATO member country, Estonia. What are the current risks of a wider war of Russia against the Baltic countries?
Russia, I don't think, would be daft enough to attack a NATO country, because that would immediately bring in Article 5. And that means an attack on one member of NATO is the equivalent of an attack on all members of NATO, and it would get a response from all members of NATO. And NATO has got a battle group, a multinational battle group, currently based on a UK brigade headquarters and formations based in the Baltics to help deter Russia. If they did attack in, then the response would be unprecedented, which would not be good for world peace, because that would be another step up the escalation ladder. Russia would have nowhere to go but to contemplate the use of nuclear weapons, and that's something we don't want to get anywhere near. So there's a lot of rhetoric will come out of Russia, a lot of threats that will be put out. NATO has to be prepared, and the Baltic states are in the front line. But I don't think even Vladimir Putin wants to attack NATO, because he knows he will lose.
Vladimir Putin has ordered to organize nuclear exercises in Russia. What is your take on that, and how could it influence the situation in Europe?
Yes, the nuclear exercises that he's undertaking at the moment are routine. They've been happening, I think, since about 2009. It's not unusual that Putin exercises his tactical nuclear capabilities and his strategic nuclear capabilities. He's done it several times since his illegal re-invasion of Ukraine just over 2 years ago. So he will always use the nuclear rhetoric to try and scare the West, to try and scare those countries that are not necessarily as supportive of the West's stance on Ukraine, but it's just words. It's rhetoric that he's using. So I'm not concerned about that at all, because I know that Western intelligence is monitoring Russian nuclear capability very, very closely indeed. That is probably the number one intelligence requirement that assets are continuously watching, to see if there's any change in the state of readiness, any change in outloading warheads or anything else. So I have confidence that we're not on the path to nuclear war just at the moment.
Are there still any people in the West who are still afraid of Russia's nuclear bluff?
I think there's lots of people who are still afraid of Russia's nuclear bluff. You find different political parties across different countries of Europe get very concerned, and where those political parties have got influence into the governmental structures or influence into elections that are coming up at the moment, then that is something that Vladimir Putin wants to try and stir the pot with. He's trying to create as much divisiveness as possible in different groupings across Europe to try and make the political focus be internally for countries in Europe, not externally in supporting Ukraine.
Financial Times reports that Russia is planning a sabotage operation in Europe. What is your take on that? And do you believe that Russia is capable of disruption of the Western aid supplies to Ukraine?
Well, I find it a very interesting report. And it's something that actually I would give a little bit of credibility to, because Russia has got a history of attacking into Western countries with weapons of mass effect. And we just look at the poisoning of Lukashenko in London with polonium-210, the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury with Novichok. And we've seen the Russian opposition leader, who's unfortunately now died, Navalny, poisoned with Novichok inside Russia and having to be treated in Germany. And the more we dig into different lower level assassinations that there have been, or attempted assassinations that have been across Europe, the more we find the Russia GRU's fingerprints all over it. It wouldn't take much for that to expand and turn into supporting terror organizations. Of course, Russia is carrying out active operations in the information domain to try and create as much split as possible. So a lot of the demonstrations that we're seeing across Europe where individuals are supporting Palestine, demonstrations that we're seeing on other political angles will have probably deep in the background somewhere an element of Russian funding and an element of the Russians helping to try and create that the disaffection that there is, and encourage those disaffected individuals to go out and protest, because they know that that causes political difficulties in the home countries.
From your perspective, how should the West respond to such sabotage operations on the European soil?
Well, if they can prove sabotage operations, and of course we saw the Nord Stream 2 pipeline being blown up, and it's still hasn't had an exact understanding of who was responsible for that. There's so many rumors going around. But if Russia did, it could be proved that Russia was directly behind any of the attacks, then I think that would be a NATO Article 4 discussion, and possibly could turn into a NATO Article 5 discussion. And therefore, Russia has to be very careful. It's the lack of attributability of the attacks, which is any attacks that come in, which would be really quite difficult. There are and there will be attacks in the information sphere using information. Physical attacks, they could happen. They could disrupt what's going on. Of course, we've seen fires in Germany only in the last week, but it's something that I think Russia would have to be very careful to ensure that they don't get a full NATO-level response. And therefore, I think if they do happen, they will be relatively low level.
Are NATO member countries ready to counter such threats from the Russian side?
NATO countries are very ready to counter such threats from wherever they come from, because if Russia does anything, it will be using known terrorist groups or bringing their own GRU terrorist type groupings into NATO. The intelligence that is looking at the terrorist threat and everything else across Europe, and in particular in the UK and the US, is phenomenal. We have stopped more terror attacks in their late stage of planning than there have been terror attacks that have actually happened. So we've got a very good understanding of what the threats are that are out there, and individuals are being watched very closely. It doesn't mean that they can't get through once or twice, but it means that they will have real difficulty in getting through and having any effect of any real substance.
In European, why did the European intelligence agencies decide to reveal such information about the Russian side?
Well, this is a very new tactic, and it's interesting. We saw it just before Russia's illegal reinvasion of Ukraine in February 2021, whenever the Americans and the British turned around and quite openly stated that the Russians were about to invade. We've seen it several times since then, where Western intelligence, and particular from the Five Eye countries, have given very clear intelligence statements about what is being planned and what could happen. And they've done that to let the Russians know that we know that they're planning it. And it's a very new use of intelligence as a weapon. So it's letting them know that they can't carry out false flag attacks if we know and have the information behind it to know exactly who's behind it. So they lose the initiative. And it's taking, in the UK, we have a phrase calling, which is pull the rug out from under the table. And that's effectively what we're doing. We're pulling that rug away from Russia so that they can't try and spin something that is completely different. Our intelligence services are providing Ukraine as much help as the defense industrial bases in the West in providing ammunition.
British Foreign Secretary David Cameron said that Ukraine had a right to use British weapons inside the Russian territory. It was the first such statement from the high-level British official. What does it mean?
I think it's a very significant statement. If you look at the British support for Ukraine the whole way through, it might not be as massive in material sense, maybe not as many tanks, maybe not as many guns, but what the UK is doing is it's leading from a political perspective that is allowing other countries then to follow suit. So it's sending a very clear message to Russia, to Vladimir Putin, that Western weapons will now be used against legitimate military targets inside Russia, and that there is political backing from that, from the UK at the moment, but I suspect other countries will come online. That will worry Vladimir Putin enormously. But it's also sending a very clear message out to our NATO and other international partners, saying, once again, the UK is leading the way on this. We have set the precedence. Now it should be okay for you to follow. We've seen that happen with training for jet pilots. We've seen that happen with delivery of tanks. We've seen that happen with delivery of other material that Ukraine is putting to good effect.
Could it mean a wider shift in the philosophy of the West on how Ukraine can use Western weapons?
I think it will, and I think it's very important that happens. We're getting reports of Russia planning greater offensives into Ukraine this year. They're recognizing now that they've only got a very small window to do that before Ukraine gets the $60 billion worth of extra aid that's coming from the United States, the additional billions of dollars or billions of euros of aid that's coming from Europe. Once Europe defense industrial base gets up to speed, and the delivery of the famed F-16s, which will hopefully give Ukraine the ability to generate local air superiority, which will give them an advantage on the battlefield. That is something where the Russians know that if they don't do something before all of that comes in, then they're never going to get the chance to expand their operations in any way, shape or form.
You mentioned about the Western support for Ukraine, Western security assistance. What do you personally expect from the European and American aid to influence the battleground in Ukraine?
I think the most important things that are coming in at the moment are artillery shells. The only reason why the Russians have regained part of the initiative on the front line is that there has not been enough artillery and artillery shells in particular supplied to Ukraine. And with that, we've got the rockets, we've got the HIMARS, and we've got the ATACMS. And then we've seen from the UK and France the Storm Shadow and Scalp. Hopefully, the Germans will look at Taurus missiles that will give the ability to attack out into targets in Crimea and targets in Russia and cut off Russian logistics. But I think the other thing that is very interesting, or the other two things that are very interesting and that people aren't focusing on, are one, the level of intelligence support that's coming from the West. That is phenomenal. And I have not seen as much intelligence being provided into a non-NATO country as is going into Ukraine. And that's helping enormously, helping to target the weapon systems very accurately indeed. And the second thing is the support that's going into, I think, an individual that will turn out to be the hero of Ukraine whenever the historians look back on this, and that's General Budanov and his, I describe it as special operations executive type operations that he's carrying out in occupied Ukraine, but also in Russia, with factories suddenly catching fire, drones attacking Russian military targets in some of their cities, hundreds of kilometers away, drones attacking Russian oil refinery capabilities, logistic bases, rail networks being interrupted. And of course, we've got almost 50% of the Russian Black Sea fleet being sunk by a country that doesn't really have an active navy. That is down to everything that General Budanov is doing, and he's getting a lot of support, I think, from the West in developing the capabilities that he needs to do that.
There have been lots of discussions about various types of weapons Ukraine had needed in the past. From your perspective, is there a kind of a new type of weapon Ukraine still needs on the battlefield?
I don't think there's a new type of weapon that Ukraine needs in the battlefield. I think it needs the wherewithal to be able to put a proper all-arms attack in to work at the front line. And to do that, Ukraine needs to be able to develop local air superiority. That requires fixed-wing aircraft. We've got the F-16s. Hopefully coming in. It requires an air defense bubble from air defense missiles. We've seen Ukraine practicing by moving its Patriot missile batteries up to the front and is having some success against Russian aircraft that thought they were safe. And we've seen Ukraine having to learn new tactics when it comes to the use of maneuver, armored maneuver in particular, with heavy tanks, with heavy infantry fighting vehicles, supported by heavy artillery. That is a complete change in tactics. And it also requires the ground to be right for that. And the ground isn't right at the moment for it. And then it's attacking in through what are the most complex defensive fields that I think we've ever seen in any conflict ever, even more complex than we've seen during the Second World War with the Russians and the Surovikin line that they put in, or the different lines of defenses that they have. So it's just giving the Ukrainians the time to get that all-arms capability ready to punch through. But at the same time, because the defenses are so strong, it's hollowing out the Russians from behind, which is what General Budanov is doing, so that whenever the attacks go in, the defensive wall will collapse. That will take time. And I think the best thing that we can get from the West, and it will be needed in Ukraine as well, is a longer-term level of political support to recognize that this is not going to be quick.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that Ukraine could launch another counteroffensive next year. What is your take on that?
I think 2025 is realistic for a proper counteroffensive. Ukraine, I think, will stabilize the front lines this year. It will push the Russians back to a degree, so regain the initiative. We'll then get into the autumn and winter months whenever the ground does not make it ideal for armored maneuver. So through the winter months, I think we will see Ukraine continuing that hollowing out in the rare areas, beginning to properly use the Western supplied aircraft, F-16s and all the rest of it, and learn how to use those properly on the battlefield, pushing Russia's air capability further back, hampering logistic bases and possibly destroying the Kirch Bridge at some stage this year or early next year, preparing for whenever the ground is right again in late spring, early summer 2025, when I would hope that the Ukrainian ground forces, Ukrainian air forces are ready for that joint punch through the Russian defensive lines. And the Russians, they're losing so many people and so much equipment on a daily basis now. They will be very hollowed out by then, I think.
I would like also to cover the Russian politics. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is beginning his another 6-year term. Do you expect him to stay in power until the end of his new term?
Well, he's 71 years old, so he'll be 77 at the end of his term if he stays alive. And staying alive in Russia is not something that's guaranteed, and no matter what position you're in. Then I think he will stay in position. His dictatorship is underpinned by organized criminality. His oligarchs are all part of organized crime gangs, and and they run their own little their little organizations. And it is that criminality that underpins the political decision-making and underpins the hierarchy. So Vladimir Putin is oligarch in chief, and he's got his other oligarchs around him, and they're all vying for power to keep the money coming in that they so much enjoy for their lifestyle and everything else. And that's why they have to keep loyal to the one individual who's giving them that political cover and that cover from anything that would stop them from a legal perspective. And that's Putin. I don't really see a natural successor for him at the moment. It's difficult to see if there's any opposition anywhere. There's no political opposition inside Russia. So I think Putin will stay for at least another 6 years. And if he believes that he can go on for 6 years after that, he will go on for another 6 years after that.
Do you see any possible threats for Putin's regime right now, or even in the future? Could any threats just pop up in the future for him?
I think there are always threats inside Russia. If you've got a bunch of criminals who are all trying to work together, but they're all out for their own self-interest, there's always a threat that's there. Now, Putin has got a ring of steel around him with those that are completely loyal to him and those that are protecting him. So, he's survived this long. There's no reason why he's not going to survive any further. However, if Ukraine has greater success in pushing Russia back out of Ukrainian sovereign territory, I think the political threat to Putin will grow from that perspective. We saw the attempted coup that happened last year. That suggests that not everything is right across all of the different areas. But then Russia is such a big country. Politically, it's got so many things it's having to try and control from one central element in Moscow, that there will always be areas that think that they can try and get one over on what's going on from a central perspective. Putin's got a good handle on it at the moment, but the biggest threat, I think, will be Ukraine having greater successes in pushing the Russians back.
Also, Chinese leader Xi Jinping is visiting Europe this week. He will be meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron. Macron would try to convince Xi to convince Putin to stop the war in Ukraine. Do you believe in that?
Well, I believe that it's a good thing for President Macron to try and do. I don't think Xi Jinping will do it at all, because Xi Jinping is effectively buying Russia. He's using and will be getting guarantees, if not ownership, of sites of Russian natural resources by part payment for his under-the-table political support, his under-the-table military support of military material that we're already beginning to see on the battlefield. But what is slightly more interesting is that the relationship that's building up between Vladimir Putin, between Xi Jinping, between Kim Jong-un, and between the Grand Ayatollah in Iran is providing a coalition that will give the international community a real headache. If you look at the way they're working together to support Russia in its illegal activities inside Ukraine, but it's also working elsewhere. That little grouping is supporting what's going on between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East and wider Middle East instability. And of course, we've got Xi Jinping's ambitions in Southeast Asia. It's very worrying times.
Thank you, Colonel Ingram, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.